Lila Grant was a quiet psychology student with a curious mind. Gerald Thompson was a retired paramedic with a dark obsession. When their paths crossed in the most ordinary of places, no one suspected that Marlow Creek would soon become the scene of one of the most disturbing crimes the town had ever seen, a case so brutal, so hidden in plain sight, that police almost walked away without ever uncovering the truth. Marlow Creek was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted peace. It was nestled between two quiet highways, with tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and a pace of life that rarely changed. The crime rate was almost non-existent. Kids played outside until sunset, families gathered in community parks, and the biggest scandal in recent years had been a grocery store overcharging for milk. So when a report of a foul odor came in on a warm August morning, no one expected it to lead to anything more than a dead animal or backed-up plumbing. The call came from a utility worker checking gas lines behind an old rental house on Elmridge Avenue. The property had been sitting vacant for a while, according to neighbors, nothing unusual in a town where properties changed hands slowly. But what the worker noticed was something different. A sharp, decaying stench was leaking from a vent at the side of the house. The smell was so strong that he couldn't continue his inspection. He notified the gas company, who then called it in as a possible health hazard. Local police responded casually, not expecting anything serious. The first officers on scene entered the property using a spare key provided by the landlord. The house was quiet, dust-covered, and appeared untouched for months. Then they opened the basement door. What they found changed everything. The basement was cold and oddly clean, no furniture, no storage, just bare concrete walls and a faint hum from an old freezer unit. In the far corner, partially hidden under a top and behind a loose shelf, was a body. It was wrapped in thick plastic, the kind used for insulation, and tightly bound with metal chains that had been bolted to the floor. The smell was unbearable. The officers called for backup, crime scene investigators, and forensic units. As news quietly made its way through the department, Marlow Creek's sense of safety began to erode. The woman's body was badly decomposed but showed signs of deliberate preparation. Her clothes had been removed. Her hair was cut short, unevenly, almost crudely. There were no identifying documents, no personal belongings, not even shoes. What stood out most was a small tattoo on her ankle, a minimalist bird in flight, and the fact that one of her fingernails was missing. Not broken or torn. Removed, the discovery sent shockwaves through the small police department. They quickly searched the rest of the house, but nothing else seemed disturbed. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no bloodstains outside the basement. The front door was locked, the windows intact. It was as if someone had entered and exited the home without a trace. The landlord insisted the house had been empty for over 6 months and provided records to prove it. What made things even more disturbing was the complete absence of any missing persons reports matching the woman's appearance. Her face, reconstructed digitally, was circulated across counties and state lines. Still, nothing. It was as if she never existed. A silent victim, hidden in plain sight, in a town that had never seen anything like this before. In the days following the discovery of the woman's body, Marlow Creek was no longer the same. Patrols increased, residents installed security cameras, and the police department found itself under a microscope. Everyone wanted answers, but investigators had almost nothing to work with. The forensic team processed every inch of the basement, collecting samples, dusting for prints, and scanning for DNA. The results were frustratingly vague. The only clear finding was that the woman had died from a blow to the head, blunt force trauma delivered with a heavy object. But there were no fingerprints, no DNA from anyone else, and no weapon left behind. It was a murder planned with precision. The landlord remained under suspicion, if only because of his connection to the property. He had owned the house for over a decade and claimed to have last visited it nearly 7 months before the body was found. At first, detectives questioned whether he might have forgotten about a previous tenant or had some hidden involvement, but his timeline held up. Credit card receipts, emails, and surveillance footage confirmed he had been out of state for weeks before and after the likely time of death. There was no evidence tying him to the crime. His keys had been accounted for, and there was no sign of any recent activity on the lease or utility bills. It was becoming clear that whoever had done this had been careful. Too careful, the investigative team next turned to the neighborhood. Officers canvassed the area, asking neighbors if they had seen anyone coming or going from the house. Most had nothing to report. A few recalled occasional lights turning on late at night but had assumed it was the landlord checking in or workers preparing the property for rental. No one had thought it strange enough to call the police. One elderly man down the street did mention seeing a dark-colored SUV parked nearby several times in the early morning hours, but he couldn't recall a license plate or even the make of the vehicle. Without more detail, the lead went nowhere. With no ID on the victim, detectives dug through missing persons reports statewide. They matched her general description, height, age range, hair color, against dozens of cases. But none aligned. The closest match was a young woman who had vanished from a bus station in another county, but her tattoo didn't match, and she was eventually found alive. Investigators even reached out to national databases. Still nothing. The tattoo on her ankle seemed like the only personal detail, but it wasn't enough. It was a common design, one that could have come from any number of tattoo shops. No unique signatures, no initials, no clues to track the artist. The media began to lose interest as the case stagnated. Without a name, a suspect, or any narrative to follow, the story started to fade from headlines. Internally, some officers feared it would become a cold case. The theory that this was a random act by a drifter or transient became the dominant one, even though it felt incomplete. The town moved on, slowly, nervously, unaware that the real story hadn't even started yet. Nearly 2 months had passed since the woman's body was discovered, and the investigation had grown quiet. Tips had slowed, the forensic lab had run out of new material, and leads had dried up. Officers were reassigned to other cases, and the once urgent energy surrounding the murder faded into a dull frustration. But then, by sheer coincidence, a small discovery reignited the case and changed everything. A rookie officer, assigned to inventory abandoned vehicles as part of a routine audit, stumbled upon a burnt-out car sitting in a police lot 2 towns over. It had been found weeks earlier near a wooded area and was assumed to be unrelated to any current investigation. But when the officer peeled back a layer of melted fabric from the floorboards, he found the faint outline of a driver's license, partially scorched but still legible. The name on it was Lila Grant. The name didn't trigger any alarms at first. But when the rookie searched it in the National Missing Persons database, a dormant file appeared. Lila had been reported missing 5 months earlier in a neighboring state. Her case had been marked as a probable runaway. Her parents had filed the report, but without signs of foul play or a clear trail, it had been quietly shelved. As soon as the name came up, detectives working the Marlow Creek case pulled Lila's details. She was 23 years old, a psychology student at a community college, and had no history of criminal behavior. She'd been described as responsible, quiet, and introverted. The real breakthrough came when investigators compared a photo from her missing persons report to the tattoo on the ankle of the unidentified victim. It was a match. The woman in the basement was Lila Grant. Her identification opened new doors. Phone records showed that her last known activity had occurred just 2 miles from the rental house. Her final call had been placed at 11:42 p.m., and then her phone went dark. Surveillance from nearby toll booths showed her car entering Marlow Creek late one evening in early March, but there was no footage of it leaving. That same car, as it turned out, was the one found burned in the woods. Detectives gained access to Lila's cloud storage, hoping to learn more about where she had gone and why. Most of her data was routine, class notes, grocery lists, and old photos. But hidden deep in a deleted folder were several images that stood out. They were grainy, taken from what appeared to be a phone camera, possibly in secret. The photos were of a man, middle-aged, dressed plainly, sometimes wearing scrubs or medical gear. In one picture, he was standing in front of the very same house where her body had been discovered. It was unclear whether Lila had been following him or if she had taken the photos out of fear. But one thing was certain, she had seen something before she died. And now, police had a face, partially captured, slightly blurred, but enough to know that someone had been watching her just as she was watching him. The blurred image of the man became the central focus of the investigation. It was the first tangible lead that pointed to someone specific, someone real. The photograph had been taken from a low angle, likely from behind a window or from inside a car. The man's face wasn't fully visible, but part of his profile was caught in a moment of stillness as he stood just outside the rental house. He wore a dark jacket, and his hands were tucked into his pockets. In another image, he appeared to be unlocking the front door. This was proof someone had been inside the house when it was supposed to be empty. Police began a careful search through local databases, comparing the photo with known offenders, landlords, service workers, and anyone with access to the neighborhood. A facial recognition specialist was brought in to enhance the image. After a few days of slow, tedious work, the system produced a list of possible matches. One name stood out, Gerald Thompson. Gerald was a 57-year-old former paramedic who had retired early after a back injury. He lived just 10 minutes outside Marlow Creek and had no criminal record. On paper, he was unremarkable. His property taxes were paid on time, he had no outstanding debts, and he had even volunteered with the local food bank. But as investigators dug deeper, they began to see another side of him. Years earlier, Gerald's ex-wife had filed multiple complaints of stalking and intimidation during their divorce proceedings. None of them led to charges, but the descriptions painted a disturbing picture: an obsessive, controlling man who didn't cope well with rejection. Neighbors from his old residence recalled odd behavior. He was always polite but watched people a little too closely, asked personal questions, and often offered unsolicited help to women, especially those who seemed isolated or vulnerable. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Gerald's current residence, a modest single-story home surrounded by overgrown hedges. What they found inside was disturbing. His house was meticulously clean, almost sterile, but certain items stood out: multiple sets of women's clothing tucked away in plastic bins, disposable phones with limited call histories, and a stack of notebooks filled with handwritten logs. Each entry was dated and detailed observations about various women: where they went, what they wore, how they reacted when spoken to. One particular notebook mentioned the girl with the bird tattoo, noting her movements weeks before her disappearance. There was no mention of her name, but the description was unmistakably Lila. Investigators also discovered a second set of keys to the Elmridge Avenue rental house hidden beneath a floor panel. The landlord later confirmed that a duplicate key had gone missing years earlier during a showing. He'd dismissed it as a simple error, but the most chilling discovery came from a hidden room in Gerald's garage. Behind a false wall was a small space lined with plastic sheeting. Inside were personal items, bracelets, lipsticks, and earrings, each placed carefully on a shelf. On the wall was a map, marked with dates and locations. In the center of it all was a photo of the Elmridge Avenue house. Gerald hadn't just used the house. He had turned it into something far worse, with mounting evidence stacked against him. Police moved quickly to bring Gerald Thompson into custody. But when they arrived at his home to arrest him, he was gone. His car had been left behind, the garage locked from the inside, and the house eerily undisturbed. It was as if he had vanished. Without warning, a manhunt was launched across state lines, with his face plastered on news outlets, gas stations, and highway signs. The quiet town of Marlow Creek was now the center of a nationwide search. For 2 weeks, there were no leads. Gerald had disappeared. Without using credit cards, cell phones, or any traceable communication. But finally, a tip came from a retired park ranger in a remote region of northern Pennsylvania. He had spotted someone who looked like Gerald buying supplies in a small-town convenience store, paying in cash and keeping his face low. The ranger had seen the news, and the man's unusual behavior raised suspicion. Local authorities were notified, and within 48 hours, they located Gerald living under a false name in a remote cabin deep in the woods. He didn't resist arrest. In fact, he seemed almost indifferent. During the interrogation, he confessed with a disturbing level of calm. He admitted to killing Lila Grant and 3 other women, each of them lured into his trap with offers of help, fake job opportunities, or feigned kindness. He explained how he'd used the rental house as a secret location, uncharted, forgotten, and easy to access without raising suspicion. The house was never his, it was simply a convenient place hidden in plain sight. He had kept track of each victim, stored mementos from them, and written notes like someone documenting an experiment. What shocked investigators most was his complete lack of emotion. He didn't apologize, didn't express regret, and didn't attempt to justify his actions. When asked why he did it, his response was quiet and cold: "I didn't want to be alone." It was a chilling answer that revealed more about his mind than any psychological report ever could. He viewed his victims not as people, but as extensions of his need to feel in control. As the trial began, the courtroom was filled with silence. Families of the victims sat in stunned disbelief as the evidence was laid out in full detail: photographs, journal entries, personal belongings retrieved from the garage. Forensic specialists testified that the way he preserved the crime scene suggested long-term planning. This was not a man who lost control. It was a man who never intended to stop. Gerald Thompson was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for the people of Marlow Creek, the damage was permanent. The illusion of safety was shattered. Parents no longer let children play unsupervised. Neighbors who once trusted each other now kept their doors locked tight. The case, nearly overlooked due to how carefully it had been concealed, served as a haunting reminder. Evil doesn't always come loudly or look dangerous. Sometimes it wears the face of someone who seems ordinary until it's too late.